Hello, my name is Gary Hines. I'm with the Palisade Historical Society. I'm here today to talk about the history of irrigation in Palisade. First of all, I'd like to thank the Mesa County Public Libraries for inviting the Palisade Historical Society to do the presentation. We always like to enjoy it. We like to come to various groups around town and talk about the history of irrigation just because it's so important. And a lot of times people don't realize how important it is to our way of life around here. When we first started this program, it was a little bit different than it is now, and it's kind of evolved over the time since about 5 years ago. We focus on the irrigation systems in Palisade. In fact, that's the title, is the history of irrigation in Palisade. But actually, over time, we've gathered more information and more pictures, and we've expanded that somewhat where we talk more about the history of irrigation and how some of the other areas around the valley developed. So we talk about everything from Palisade all the way pretty much to the state line, and have expanded it that way. So anyway, we're glad you're going to be able to join us today, and hope you'll come away with a greater understanding of the importance of irrigation and the efforts that it took here in the valley to make reliable systems work for us agriculturally and otherwise as well. I've got a personal connection with the irrigation history in the Grand Valley. I grew up here, so I always knew how important irrigation was. My grandparents on my mom's side of the family were caretakers of the roller dam in Debec Canyon from 1926 until 1959. So I got to go up there as a youngster and watch Grandpa do what he did with the roller dam to make it work and stuff like that. Then on the other end, my dad's side of the family, they were end users of the system. They bought land and planted orchards on East Orchard Mesa in the early 1930s. And so we used it there. And then growing up, my parents had land and orchards about a half a mile west of Granddad's place. So I grew up around irrigation and peaches and all that kind of stuff until about 1963, when the big freeze came along. It killed a lot of the trees in the valley, and it changed things for a lot of people. So anyway, I'd invite you to join me through this time travel as we learn the interesting history of irrigation in the valley and the fact that it's really the true lifeblood of our existence here. So in this first slide, nothing grows without irrigation. You can see from this photo, which was taken from the top of the Book Cliffs up above Palisade, the interstate highway runs right along there, and everything north of there is pretty barren because there's no irrigation up there. And then on the top part of the photo, you see the green valley where all the irrigation is. So anyway, people sometimes don't appreciate the impact of irrigation and how difficult it was for people to develop that. The systems that they developed were costly. There were a lot of problems with poor construction. There were a lot of equipment failures early on. Financial problems were common. And then there were always concerns over water rights and who got to use the water. And then, of course, politics got involved too there. In this next slide, just another illustration of the impact of irrigation. This was taken up on about 36 and 5/8 road. So you can see on the upper part of the photograph, the barren land up above Canal number 2 on Orchard Mesa there. And then what happens when you add water to that with the orchards and the fields and that sort of thing. It really does demonstrate the vital impact that the irrigation systems had in the Grand Valley. Next here are the Colorado rivers and lakes. Literally all but one river runs out of Colorado. They start in Colorado, so we truly are the headwaters. And you might have heard a lot of talk here recently about water rights and the impact it has on Colorado and the western slope. And, we're really protective around here of our water, which has some of the oldest rights in the state. We're pretty protective of that water being diverted from the western slope over to the Front Range for that reason, because it's so vital to us. Here's an interesting map of the valley. This over here would be on the left side of the screen would be the area around the state line in Loma. And on the right side of the screen would be the area around Palisade, with the mouth of Debec Canyon being right about there. So you can see that this large green area is the area that's under irrigation from the Grand Valley Water Users Association, which gets its water diverted from the Colorado River out at the Roller Dam up into Beck Canyon. And then the large purple area in the center is the Grand Valley Irrigation Company, and where it has its water. The tan area has the Palisade Irrigation District, and then this darker blue area is the Mesa County Irrigation District. So basically, the Mesa County Irrigation District would be areas that are watered by the Stub ditch, and the tan area would be areas that are watered by the Price ditch. The kind of aqua-colored area at the bottom down here represents land that's under irrigation on Orchard Mesa with the Orchard Mesa Irrigation District. And then the red or pink area here represents the Redlands, where water comes from actually the Gunnison River instead of the Colorado River. So those are the 6 areas that we have. Also, it's important to know that the green area, the dark blue, the tan, and the aqua area all get their water from water that's been diverted from the Colorado River at the Roller Dam. And then Grand Valley Canal System gets their water taken out directly at Palisade. And then Redlands Power Canal gets their water from the Gunnison River, which is diverted over on the Redlands. Okay, so construction began on the irrigation projects as soon as the Ute Indians were forcibly removed from the Grand Valley in September of 1881. This photo here shows the men and equipment that were used to dig the Grand Valley Canal headgate in 1883. Then in this next photo, this is a more modern photo. That's what the headgates look like now. If you go up on the Orchard Mesa Hill, which is 38 Road, and look down on the river, you can see where the water is diverted for the Grand Valley Canal System. Or you can go to the end of Brentwood Drive out past Taylor Elementary School in Palisade and look out over the river and see headgates there. This next slide is a 1901 USDA Grand Valley Canal System map. We had some friends that have done some local history here, Steve and Denise Height, that helped us with some of the history here. And here's where we talk a little bit about some of the west end of the valley history, where back in 1894, Frank Kiefer and his 3 brothers began to construct what's known as the Kiefer extension on the Grand Valley Canal. So they dug up 17 miles of new ditch, which was completed in 1898. So this brought about 10,000 extra acres under irrigation northwest of Fruita, and it greatly increased the productivity of that region. It's important to note that there's 2 Highline Canals in the Grand Valley. One is a branch off of the main Grand Valley Canal, which they called the Highline, which was built earlier. And then the other is called the Government Highline Canal, which was built by the U.S. Reclamation Service when the Roller Dam was built. This upper line up here is where you would see the Government Highline Canal was staked out. Below, on the lower end of the valley, they had 2 ditches that pumped water from the river. A mile south of Fruita, there was the Independent Ranchman's Ditch for Fruita. Then there was this Pacific Slope Ditch for Grand Junction. Then the Pioneer or Mesa County Ditch. And then you can see on this map that the Independent Ranchman's Ditch roughly follows the line of River Road all the way from town in Grand Junction all the way to Fruita. So that's what the canal systems looked like in 1901. Here's a picture of the Redlands Dam on the Gunnison River. It was built in 1907, and it was completed across the Gunnison to provide water for the Redlands Mesa Power Canal. So 10 years later, by 1917, the canal also provided water for an additional 3,800 acres of land on Redlands Mesa. Now we're going to jump back to the other end of the valley up in Rapid Creek up above Palisade. Here's the grave marker of John Petal Harlow. Mr. Harlow was an early settler in the Grand Valley. He came here in 1881. He began diverting water from Rapid Creek east of Palisade into what they called the Grapevine Ditch. And he also built another ditch called the Crawford Ditch, which was built in 1888 and diverted water from Rapid Creek up above the Grapevine Ditch. And then it ran north over a large tract of land called the Lloyd Ranch, which is near Mesa, Colorado. And the Grapevine and the Crawford ditches are no longer in use. And the farms on the Rapid Creek now get their water from the Orchard Mesa Irrigation Canal. Then we have Colonel Bauer, another Palisade resident, who was one of the early settlers in the valley. He diverted water from the river to water land in the Vinelands, which originally was called Poverty Flats, east of Palisade. And then John Gordon owned a pumping plant in the Vinelands also, and brought water to the Orchard Mesa Canal through the eastern part of the Vinelands. And Frank Berger built another canal called the Mount Lincoln Ditch early in 1890. It was to be laid out near the proposed Highline Canal, which came along later. And they used only electric pumps to lift water from the river. The Highline Mutual Irrigation Company was incorporated in 1894 with plans to build a ditch all the way west to the Utah line. So the company purchased Mr. Berger's Mount Lincoln Ditch in 1894. This later became known as the Price Ditch. Here's a couple of maps that we put together of another canal system. It was called the Smith and Struthers Ditch from 1892 and also 1894. So in 1892, they made an attempt called the Alta Land and Water Company, whose principals were George Smith and Alexander Struthers, to build a 6-mile canal using Grand River water, which is actually Colorado River, and its swan pump failed after only 2 or 3 days of operation. So 2 years later, in 1894, Smith and Struthers tried again with a Smith and Struthers ditch. So they took water at that time from Plateau Creek above the confluence of where it runs into the Colorado River. And the water was transported across the river on a pipe that was supported by cables. Well, what problems happened was that the creek didn't supply enough water, and a lot of the ditch washed away in a heavy rainstorm, so the whole project was abandoned in 1908. So you can see here on the map, if you look carefully, where that pipeline crossed the river right along in there. The Stub ditch was in its flume around 1912. As a matter of fact, they began building it in 1903, but under the name of the Highline Mutual Irrigation Company. So they authorized the construction of this second canal, which later became known as the Stub ditch. And it began delivering water in 1904, and it has the distinction of being the only irrigation project in the county that was developed solely by the landowners. So in 1904, the Mount Lincoln Power Canal and the powerhouse suffered damage from spring runoffs. They had a lot of financial troubles, and when the pumping plant needed to be rebuilt, it was going to cost them $34,000, which the company couldn't pay without going bankrupt. So the voters approved the Palisade Irrigation District to float bonds for the indebtedness to fund the repairs. So the first action of the Palisade Irrigation District was to purchase the Mount Lincoln Land and Water Company and the Highline Mutual Irrigation System with all of its canals and water rights and pumping plants and related land for $150,000 in January of 1905. Gravity-fed ditchers were not sustainable, and there was a lot of seasonal variation in river height. So a lot of the early projects used electric power only to pump water into the canals. There was always an irregular supply of water, and in fact in 1909 it caused so much conflict that the Palisade Irrigation District ditch riders were appointed sheriff's deputies to keep the peace amongst the people. You can see in this photo there's a horse and buggy down along that part of the photograph right there. That's about where the current Highline Canal is, and this is in an area just as you're coming out of DeBeck Canyon into the area up of Palisade. You can see the Book Cliffs there in the background. So that's the where that photo was taken from back in 1912. Here we have a photo of the construction of the Price Stub ditch in 1910. It was a dam that they built across the river there. There was so much trouble with irregular water supply that they decided the solution for that was to build a dam across the whole river. So this shows the construction of that dam, which was completed in 1910. And here's another later photo of the same dam. That dam is located just upstream from where the current I-70 bridge goes across the Colorado River as you leave Palisade going up into DeBeck Canyon. There's a fish ladder that was added there on the east side of the dam in 2007. There's a lot of riprap material that was added to the dam later on, so it doesn't look the way it does here in the photo anymore. So this photo is a whole different presentation of what it used to look like back in the day. Here we have what the inside of the Stub pump house looks like after 1919. The water supply from the river to the Stub and Price ditches was pretty much unreliable over the growing season. And so in 1915, the roller dam was completed and the water was running in the government Highline Canal. And by 1917, officials of the Palisade and the Mesa County irrigation districts approached the government with a proposal to pump water through the Price Ditch feeder canal into the Stub ditch in exchange for both canals' older water rights. So the construction of the new pump plant at the Stub ditch was completed in January of 1919. Here's a map of 1905 of the Alkali. So water wasn't the only thing. Soil was also very important. So besides Palisade's perfect climate for growing peaches, you can also see from this map that they had good soil there. The darker areas of the map are where the larger concentrations of alkali lie, and you can see that that's down closer to the river, and the areas further away from the river are freer of the alkali. So that was the area that was better for growing crops and that sort of thing. In the next slide, this is the construction of another dam that is no longer here. This was the dam that they built across the Colorado River up above the current roller dam. And this was completed in 1909. And the dam was removed later on, but it was a diversion dam about a half a mile above the roller dam. The 9-mile-long wood stave power canal was built on the east side of the river, and several siphons and flumes were also built to get the water over uneven terrain from the dam to the base of the East Orchard Mesa Hill there. And here's another photo of the construction of the pumping plant that serves East Orchard Mesa. So this is a view from the top of East Orchard Mesa. There's another little irrigation system. It was called the South Palisade Irrigation District that was built just east of the Orchard Mesa Irrigation District. It had a 300 horsepower gas-reducing pumping plant, but it was also the largest of its kind that was ever erected in Colorado. And it was had a lot of trouble, and it was finally abandoned in 1918. And if you know where the Sobre El Rio subdivision is, there on the east end of Orchard Mesa, that's about where the South Palisade Irrigation District was. And after they lost their water, they just had to abandon their orchards up there, and that's why it reverted back to desert. Here's another photo of the men pounding the rivets into the Penstocks, which are the pipes that go up the hill for the Orchard Mesa Irrigation District project that was built in 1910. So this is just another example of the hard work that it took to build these systems. And it's important to note that a lot of the original structures are still in place and still functioning today. Here's another photo from 1939 of the pumping plant that pumps water from the canal and the river up to Orchard Mesa onto the two canals up there. This is what Orchard Mesa looked like before we had irrigation. Before that time, it was pretty much just for cattle grazing. The land wasn't usable for very much of anything else. It did have very good soil, but it lacked irrigation water, so it took a lot to get the irrigation up to that area so that it's productive like it is now. So you can kind of see from this early history how complex and difficult it was to build all these systems. So in 1915, when the roller dam came along, this was really viewed as a good solution for a lot of the smaller irrigation projects to be able to have their irrigation water on a more consistent basis. The Palisade Historical Society celebrated the 100th birthday of the roller dam 5 years ago in 2015. So we sponsored a big birthday party for the roller dam in June of that year. Here's a slide from Danny Williams. Danny's grandfather was one of the people that worked on the construction of the roller dam. So he took a lot of pictures to document that important feat for Grand Valley irrigation. So here you can see the early construction of the roller dam and all the mules and the horses and the men that it took to do all of that work. The Grand Valley Project was one of the first 6 projects that was activated by the Reclamation Act of June in 1902, which created the Reclamation Service, which later became the Bureau of Reclamation. And they withdrew land from settlement to prevent it from being dispersed before the projects were completed. The canal routes were surveyed in 1897, and the work on the alignment of the canals was begun in 1902. And they concluded that the flow of water was sufficient to supply 2,000 acre-feet of water during irrigation season, but it really wasn't practical to extend the system all the way into Utah as some people had envisioned. But it would reach another 51,000 additional acres of land to irrigate at the cost of $27 per acre. So in 1903, a Grand Junction group proposed that the project be constructed and paid for with private funds. So the government backed out because they didn't want to interfere with private enterprise. But after several years, it became apparent that the plan for the private construction was not going to proceed. So after a lot of lobbying by the Grand Valley Water Users Association and businesses, the Secretary of the Interior agreed. And on November 25th, 1907, with a vote of unanimous approval, they decided to go ahead and resume construction of the canal system that they had planned. So in 1908, Chief Engineer E.E. Sands was appointed to the project, and he established a field camp on the Grand River Canyon northeast of Palisade, and he began detailed mapping of the area to stake out the canal routes. So the final locations of the main canal from the headgate to Palisade was staked out with alternatives locations determined, and a topographical survey was completed showing the final location for the main canal. But there were more delays, and the Secretary of Interior, Walter Fisher, finally gave the Reclamation Service approval to begin construction of the roller dam in 1912. They had to negotiate an agreement with the DNRGW Railroad to raise the tracks 5 feet at the dam site without disrupting railroad traffic, because they didn't want the dam to back up the water and flood the railroad tracks. So the work to raise the railroad tracks began in April of 1914, and it was completed in June. And what they did is they used material that was from the main canal excavations, and it was spread over the railroad tracks. And they jacked the tracks up, and then they spread the material underneath the tracks, and then let the tracks back down. So they used Greek railroad employees, which were paid a government wage of $1.75 a day. Of course, if you were a supervisor, you got $80 a month. So anyway, when the roller dam was constructed, they used what they called a roller crest design. It was chosen instead of a conventional dam plan because they wanted to have the flexibility of adjusting the rollers so they could avoid flooding out the railroad tracks. So the level of the water behind the dam stays consistent depending on the condition of the river and where the rollers are. So they installed 6 large steel rollers across the river, and that's why it's called the roller dam. It's also known as the Grand River Diversion Dam, but we call it the roller dam. Here's a photo of the tunnels. There were 3 tunnels built between the roller dam and Palisade to run water through because of all the uneven terrain there. They varied in length from 1,655 feet long to an astonishing 1 3/4 miles long, constructed between the roller dam and Palisade. Here in the photo here, you can see horses and wagons removing material from the excavation. I have to tell you a story that my mom used to tell. She lived up at the roller dam, and the only way you could get from Cameo, which was the mining town below the roller dam, was across this swinging bridge. Well, there was a guy on a motorcycle, and he drove across the swinging bridge one night, and his motorcycle backfired and sparked, and it caught the bridge on fire. So the bridge burned. So there was no way for them to get across the river. So what they did was, this was in the wintertime, luckily, they used the number 3 irrigation tunnel to get between Cameo and Palisade. In fact, they even drove their cars through the tunnel to get there. It was pretty amazing. But by the time the irrigation season came along, they were able to get the bridge replaced or repaired or whatever it was they did, so that water could come back into the tunnel again. It was pretty interesting. Here's another photo. I really like this photo of when they were building the irrigation, or when they were building the roller dam. You can see they've started the work on the piers that you see now. And then what they did is they built a coffer dam across the river, which you can see right there. And that backed up the water. As a matter of fact, the water is back here. And they did it in the wintertime. So this white area that you see is ice that's on the river. And they diverted all that water over to the far side of the river through the sluiceway there while they dried out the riverbed to construct the piers for the roller dam. So initially, a German firm by the name of Maschinenfabrik Ausberg Nuremberg AG held the patents for the roller crest design. So the original plan was for the rollers to be manufactured in Germany and then shipped to the United States. There's a local historian that concocted a story about the first sets of rollers being constructed in Germany and carried by ships across to the United States and being sunk by the British Navy as part of the embargo that led to World War I. But it's a nice story, but looking at documentation in the engineering journals, it was found that the more true story was that the German firm decided that they were not going to be able to do the construction of the rollers in Germany, so they couldn't fulfill the contract. So there was another company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania called the Ritter Conley Manufacturing Company that actually fabricated the rollers using the German company's design. Now the rollers were put on the railroad and they were shipped to the dam site. So by the time the rollers got to the dam site, a lot of the work had already been done on the dam. There wasn't any road that went through the canyon at the time, so the railroad was really the only way they could get the rollers there. So they got the first roller installed in March of 1915, and then the second roller, or the final roller, was installed in June of 1915. And so this whole project, Roller Dam and the government Highline Canal and the other 5 canals are all known now as the Grand Valley Project. And it stretches over 90 miles of canal work from the roller dam all the way to Mac. Here's another photo of what equipment was used to excavate for the canal systems, which were started in 1913. And here they were digging the Highline Canal, and this work was completed in 1914. So here's another slide. This shows the men and the mules that were digging the government Highline Canal, and you can see how much work that entailed. The work on the government Highline Canal was completed in 1917, and then they completed all of the canals and the tunnels and the flumes and the siphons that were necessary to bring water to the land for irrigation. There were times when the canal and the railroad had to cross. This particular photo was taken in Tibet Canyon before you get to Cameo, so you can see where the railroad track runs over the canal. So the canal was constructed underneath the railroad track there. Then another picture, a very dusty photo of men working again on excavating the government Highline Canal. Another problem that happened was that leaks developed along the canal, so accommodations had to be made for proper drainage. But as early as 1904, farmers started recognizing the need for the drainage, so they developed the Grand Valley Drainage District. It was formed before 1915, before water was ever delivered through the roller dams system. So in 1921, they began work on constructing the siphon underneath the river. So water was taken from the government Highline Canal under the river into a power canal that stretched all the way to the east end of Orchard Mesa. And then it was pumped up into the 2 canals on Orchard Mesa. And the Grand River was then renamed the Colorado River that same year, 1921. So when the Orchard Mesa diversion dam above the roller dam was no longer needed, it was removed. And if you look quickly when you're going on I-70 traveling east, before you get to the Beaver Tail Tunnel, you can see where that old abutment is, the concrete abutment on the other side of the river. So here's the foundation for the river Gatehouse. This will probably look familiar to you. And this is the Gatehouse as you see it today. And it's still visible across the river from I-70. It's between exits 42 and 44. And it diverts 800 cubic feet per second of water into the Orchard Mesa Irrigation District's Power Canal. The proposed straightening of that curve on the highway, which the Department of Transportation wanted, would have spent $71 million. And that could have had some pretty devastating consequences for agricultural land on Orchard Mesa, which depends on water from that power canal. So it was a good thing that they proceeded the way they did and didn't do that. Another important development that happened was the Colorado River Compact in 1922. So about the time that the siphon was being constructed on the Colorado River, the Colorado River Compact was done in 1922, which is an agreement between 7 states, the upper basin and the lower basin. So the upper basin states were Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, and the lower basin states were California, Arizona, and Nevada. But especially California and Las Vegas have outgrown their allotment for the water. So with the recent droughts, keeping the water rights for agriculture has been very challenging for us. Last year, our needs for water for our canals in the Grand Valley exceeded the supply. So the Orchard Mesa Irrigation District provided a list of entities that gave us some of their water rights temporarily. Most of this came from the Rudai Reservoir to allow the Colorado River to meet the needs of our older water rights for both irrigation, for agriculture, and to sustain the fish as well. You can see here the Orchard Mesa Power Canal was on the east side of the river where I-70 is now located. It runs along right there. In 1909, the original Orchard Mesa Diversion Dam, located some 3,000 feet upstream from the planned Grand River Diversion Dam. And the original plan was that they were going to divert water from the roller dam and put it directly into that canal. But it's a good thing that they didn't do that, because then later on it would have caused some problems for the construction of I-70 through that area. So using funds advanced from Public Service Company of Colorado, a power plant was constructed just north of the 1910 pumping plant here at the Orchard Mesa Irrigation District. And here you can see CCC workers, that's Civilian Conservation Corps workers, working on the power plant. They're working on a retaining wall there. They were there in the 1930s, and this was part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal program, which provided unskilled manual labor jobs to young men during the Great Depression. So the CCC workers were employed on public works projects, including conservation and forest work and the construction of public buildings and roads. The CC workers did a lot of the work on the rock walls and the buildings at the roller dam. And at the other end of the valley, they built roads and buildings for the Colorado National Monument. The CCC camp that was located in Palisade was at what was at the east end of Riverbend Park, near the Grand Valley Canal head gates. Here's another photo of the power plant from 1939. You can see the CCC workers putting the final touches on the retaining wall, which extends several hundred feet west from the newly constructed power plant there. The Orchard Mesa pumping plant pumps irrigation water some 300 feet to 2 canals up on East Orchard Mesa. And then the 3,000 kilowatt capacity hydroelectric plant, now operated by the Orchard Mesa Irrigation District, uses only water to drive the pumps which supply water for the irrigation season, as well as to generate electricity 11 months out of the year. The hydroelectric plant is in the process of being rebuilt to make it more efficient and to replace deteriorating equipment. This is a view of inside the Orchard Mesa power plant. It diverts 800 cubic feet of water from the Highline Canal via the Colorado River siphon. It supplies the 15.5 mile long Canal number 1 and the 16.1 mile long Canal number 2 on Orchard Mesa. In March of 1941, significant damage was discovered in the Highline Canal, tunnel number 3. And it was pretty close to the beginning of the irrigation system, so it wasn't possible to make permanent repairs. And almost 100 feet of the tunnel was completely rebuilt after the irrigation season ended. In 1949, the Bureau of Reclamation turned over operation of the Grand Valley project, which was the roller dam and the government Highline Canal, to the Grand Valley Water Users Association. But the problems continued, and minor repairs were done along the way. But in 1950, over 450 feet of tunnel number 3 completely collapsed. And you can see here in the photo that collapse in the tunnel, the timbers and that sort of thing. And here's another shot that shows a car in that tunnel. Palisade's Wayne Aspinall, who served in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1949 to 1973, mustered the federal funds necessary to repair the tunnels in a record time. What they did is they drove at it midway between the two ends of the tunnel, and then they dug in all 4 directions to make the new tunnel, and they hauled it through on April 4th, 24 days ahead of schedule. And then the water deliveries began on May 4th, so they were able to continue without interrupting the water throughout the season. Then they did more permanent repairs in December after the water was no longer needed and their water was out of the tunnels. And here you can see a car that was driven down into the tunnel to either inspect the damage or to look at the work that was being done on the repair. Then when I-70 was constructed through Tibet Canyon, the Orchard Mesa Power Canal and part of the Colorado River siphon and the extension of the lower part of the number 3 tunnel had to be rebuilt. And in 1989, we had 25,544 total acres on 803 farms that were under irrigation, with an average crop yield of $512.52 per acre. In addition, over 21,000 non-farm individuals received Grand Valley Project irrigation water. The roller dam was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in October of 1991. The mission of the Palisade Historical Society is to collect, preserve, and communicate the unique history of Palisade and to foster, encourage, stimulate, and develop public appreciation of this history. So we're a continually active, all-volunteer organization. We offer a variety of programs. We've done classes for New Dimensions, Western Colorado Community College, as well as Grey Gourmet. We've done guided walking tours of downtown Palisade. This last year, we also provided historic Palisade coloring books and programs to over 300 elementary school students here in the valley, thanks to funding from area Rotary clubs. And our historic walking tour brochure is also available as an ebook. One of our major projects has been to get as many issues of the Palisade Tribune as possible online with the Colorado Historic Newspaper Collection, which is part of the State Library. So to date, we have over 2,650 issues online, including all known issues from the first one in 1903 through 1950, as well as other more recent issues. The neat thing about this is that the database is searchable, so it makes it a really excellent tool for doing historical research, looking up information on your family members. I found out that my grandmother, for example, won all kinds of awards for flowers that she'd grown back in the 1940s, and or simply just learning what life was about back in that day, looking at the advertisements and that kind of thing. So it's pretty cool. You can find us, we have a website, historicpalisade.org. We also have a Facebook. So if you go to Facebook and just type in the search bar Palisade Historical Society, that will bring up our Facebook page. We're very excited. We're just about ready to open a new history museum in Palisade, the very first history museum we've had. Last year we were able to acquire a low-cost lease, long-term, on this building that you see in the picture here, and we raised over 80% of the $125,000 that we need to do renovations to convert this historic log building into a museum. The building was originally a garage for a longtime resident of Palisade by the name of George Bunty. Mr. Bunty had a trucking operation in Palisade, and he used this building to work on his trucks. And then we were able to acquire this, and we're doing some renovations to hopefully later on in the year open it up as the first historical museum for Palisade. So this pretty much concludes our brief history of irrigation systems in the Grand Valley. It's a lot more than just Palisade, so I'm glad you could join us today and hope that you've enjoyed it and you take away a greater appreciation and understandings of the hardships, the failures, and the ultimate successes that have brought the lifeblood of irrigation water to our way of life here. Thank you.